Andy Eastlake, Managing Director, Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, and Ben Lawson, Head of Policy, Public Affairs at the Future Urban Mobility Partnership. One after the other, quick, come and make your case. As you're standing. Well, just make it snappy and then we'll get to some discussion. So, Rachel, how are you going to make it happen?
My goodness me. Have I got a clicker? No. You've got no? Oh, there it is. Right, wonderful. Thank you. Right. Okay, right, we'll try and condense this right down. Right, fantastic. Thank you very much. Fantastic to be here this afternoon. So I was here about, I think it was 18 months ago when we last did one of these. So great to be back. Obviously it went okay. That's all good. So I wanted to dive in extremely quickly and just kind of, I guess, jog through a number of different areas that I think will be really important to making it happen. So in the grand scheme of things, we know, and because we've been hearing about it all day, that we are dealing with all sorts of change, all sorts of uncertainty, all sorts of things that we can and can't predict right now. I won't spend time going through what all of these are, because clearly we're all kind of familiar with this now, aren't we? But have a look at how all the Ds that we've just been talking about there, hearing from the Minister, are also appearing on these slides here. It's not a great surprise. So we're talking about change to do with the decarbonisation agenda, to do with zero-emission vehicles. We're talking about data, digital, connectivity, automation, new modes coming through, micro and macro scale, evolving business models. That's exactly where that new potential for perhaps pay-as-you-go road charging and so on might come in. Evolving the whole sort of system, I guess, in terms of how it actually works, no matter how you travel. And finally, a piece around people and behaviours, which is actually quite new in terms of the sort of the policy and the strategy thinking that's coming through at the moment. I think, to me, what's interesting about this is I think there's a second list of change as well, beyond the things that we can immediately see in that mobility space that are kind of in the centre there. I've already mentioned the decarbonisation side of things, but who would have guessed a year ago that the public interest in net zero would be what it is right now? It was pretty unpredictable. It happened pretty much at the start of this year, and it feels very much like there's no going back. That changes the context in which we're actually going to be doing things as we go forward. There's also a piece around some new values being attached to things, and again, we've heard some of this already this afternoon in terms of productive places, distinctive places, the way that the places connect to each other. That's not just a physical connection in terms of transport networks and so on, it's also the digital connection that goes on between different people and places and so on. It feels like we're in the midst of quite a lot of change and quite a lot of importance being attached to that. And I think, again, at risk of sort of repeating some of what I've already been hearing, but this change is not just about people, it's also about goods, it's about services, it's absolutely about the logistics and the freight and the way it all actually goes together and works. So that's, if you were to look at it sort of cold, you could say, right, the tech's telling us that this is what's happening, this is what we need to cater for, off we go. However, I'm always one to unpick an exam question. If you actually think about what doesn't the tech tell us, that takes us in a slightly different direction, because actually it starts to talk to us about what isn't changing. We definitely, absolutely, as society, want to be more connected than ever. We don't want to be less connected, that's for sure. Again, it's a physical connection. It is about transport and mobility, but it's also, again, about that digital piece. There is absolutely no sign of anybody desiring less movement, less connectivity as we go forward. And also what isn't changing, the fact that we want stuff to come to us. We might well do our shopping in different ways, we may well look at different retail models, we look at different ways to pay for things, but we still want stuff in our house, we still want stuff around us, we still want, whatever the creature comforts of the day might be. There is absolutely no sign that any of that is going to be going anywhere. So even if we end up introducing all sorts of new technologies, new modes, new ways of, localizing production, new ways of splitting loads so that things are much more efficient in terms of logistics and freight and so on. Even once you've done all of that, the fact remains there is still absolutely a huge, great demand. You wouldn't necessarily get that just by looking at the tech from the front end, sort of looking outwards. You've got to actually look at what society wants as well. It also, I think, doesn't tell us what's important or what's acceptable. The tech tells us what's possible, but it doesn't tell us necessarily what's desirable in terms of outcomes. And I think it's very important to me, at least, that we really think hard about what we actually want to achieve in terms of those outcomes. And I think it's great to see some of those sorts of thoughts coming through in the strategy. I think just sort of carrying on with that thought a minute, when the tech doesn't tell us what's important, it also doesn't talk to us specifically, because you can't see it at the level of one individual piece of technology or change. You can't really get to the end in terms of what a great outcome looks like or what a terrible outcome looks like. You end up sort of having to live with whatever you get just because you found yourself in a position where that's what it is. That becomes very reactive. It's not necessarily a very productive way of doing things. And if we're not careful, it ends up favouring those who, well, essentially those who end up benefiting most commercially instead of thinking about the social side of things and so on. It obviously, unfortunately, there is no roadmap for these things. There is no map that says, there's a bear trap over there, or there's a pot of gold sitting at the end of the rainbow over there. We're not going to know which of these solutions necessarily are the right ones, but we can absolutely get better at figuring out what the outcomes are we're after, and then constantly reshifting our focus to take account of all those different things. So that brings me very briefly around to exactly what I was just saying there. I think the most critical thing that we can get right at the moment is this sort of focus on outcome-led thinking. And there's a bit of a kind of a cooking analogy in my head here. It's not just about sort of flinging the ingredients in the pot and just kind of hoping for the best. Actually, I think it genuinely is also about the recipe. It's about the sequencing. It's about the way things go together. It's the detail that is actually going to matter. The good news on this front is we actually do know what we want. When I'm talking about outcomes, we know we want, we've heard it all, we know we want a system that is cleaner, that is fair, that's equitable, encourages healthy movement, it's efficient, affordable, convenient, easy, reliable, flexible. You can go on and on with all these things in terms of what the overall system should do. In terms of routes, we spend a fortune at the moment. The cost of congestion, the cost of poor road safety in some places and so on, it costs us billions every year as a country. We know we want to fix that. Of course we do. We know we want easy interchange. We know we want efficient movement. And we know we want a system that's funded in terms of the way that whole network goes together. And that, again, plays to that pay-as-you-go or road pricing type point, which I think is going to be, frankly, from my point of view, an absolutely essential way of changing the way we currently pay to move. And we know for society we want to move, we want to connect, as I was saying. We want to have what we want. We want to connect homes to jobs, to retail, leisure, commercial, etc., etc. But we also want to live in places that are valuable and distinctive and actually feel unique. So it makes it pretty tricky to get it right in the grand scheme of things, because all these things are shifting and all the technologies are coming to market all the time, and it's not neat and tidy. And the trouble is, of course, there's not one answer. We have no crystal ball, so we're going to have to do our best. What I would say, is just a sort of a few thoughts around that, is I think it's rather easy, isn't it? It's very tempting to grab onto something that we think we can understand. And I'm seeing this a little bit in the electric vehicle space at the moment. We kind of grab it and go, right, okay, electric. Yep, we can do electric. But you can have electric good or you can have electric bad in terms of outcomes, because we don't want to just switch all the cars for electric equivalents. That doesn't fix congestion, doesn't fix safety, doesn't fix all sorts of other stuff. We need to think about where that electric piece fits in, and that's just one example of all the different aspects that I've been talking about. So when you start to look at that same list again as the one on the previous slide, those 6 different things that are actually changing, you can combine these in all kinds of different ways. They're all shifting, they've all got change going on inside them. And the trouble is, if we were to do a quick poll in terms of what people think is important, we're all going to say different things. Because it depends. Your view on what's important depends on who you are. Are you young? Are you old? Are you adventurous? Are you timid? Where you are, because place matters. When you are, because some of these things can only happen in sequence. And also sort of what you are, if you like. I mean, am I, are we dealing with people? Are we dealing with boxes of strawberries? Are we dealing with great big freight containers coming in full of dishwashers? It matters, because the different things you can do vary massively according to what the things are you're actually trying to move around. So I guess that leads me to 3 things in conclusion. In terms of what we can take from this, where can we be more certain, given it's so difficult? Well, first, yep, it's complicated, but luckily we're a smart bunch of people. We can figure this out and we know what good looks like. So even if we don't know quite how to get from A to B, we can figure out if we're going roughly in the right direction in terms of a kind of a compass point. Second, as I was saying, I don't think we can have a singular focus on just one aspect of this. We've got to get across all these different dimensions of change, and we've got to think really hard about the context, and that's where at the level of TFSE and elsewhere around the country where there are similar challenges being dealt with, it's really important that all these strategies that are coming forward actually have some teeth to make a difference in terms of generating the locally appropriate, I guess, solutions. And I think the third thought is that we need really to make sure that we find the sweet spot, because all these things that are shifting, yes, they're moving all the time, but there must be optimum combinations of different things that we can think about. And the good news on this is there is a lot of thinking that's already being done around this. I can't talk about the detail now, there's not time, but we did some really interesting work last year for the DFT, looking at a number of national level scenarios across exactly these kinds of dimensions and what actually happens and what matters and so on. And what's really interesting there is that it did matter, because the outcome, the actual results, vary massively according to what you do. So it's not going to be good enough to kind of just go along and get along, because we're going to end up with something that isn't nearly as good as what we could have had if we'd actually got ourselves organised from the beginning, if that makes sense. So it really does matter. So I think overall we have no choice but to engage with this. is the message that then I guess I'd leave you with. I think we absolutely have to lead. I think we need to own the vision. I think we need to collaborate. We need to be really clear what it is we're trying to achieve. Because standing still, and I guess there's no pun really intended in terms of mobility, but it's not an option because relatively speaking, you're going backwards, aren't you? If you're not doing anything and you're spending too much time thinking about it. And if you're going to be reactive, then by definition, you can never be ahead of what's actually coming. You can never actually catch that. So we need not just to find that sweet spot, but we need to keep an eye on it. We need to repeat the trick again and again. So overall, we're sort of standing at the entrance to a maze, I think. We can't quite see where we're going, but we know roughly where the exit might be, hopefully, and I guess it's a series of exits. I think that the strategy that we've seen being launched here, and again, similar things that are coming forward around the country really are absolutely critical to starting to get this right. The strategy matters, but also stability matters, and a coherent long-run plan matters, and that's where the policy is really going to matter in terms of how we actually make this happen. It's not just about why it's important or what it's going to be, it's actually genuinely about how we're going to do it. It doesn't mean it has to be completely fixed. As I've said, I think it's going to vary massively in terms of what comes to market, what works, what's shown, the different business models and so on. We've already discussed, haven't we, just now, the future mobility zones and how they hopefully will spit out all kinds of interesting learning and so on. So I think, in closing, there is so much changing. And it's great to see Transport for the South East finding its voice around so many of these issues. But really the key is that almost today is the start, isn't it? If this is the strategy right now, okay, how do we get there? How do we figure out how we start to take those baby steps along the way? I will stop there because I'm conscious we're under massive pressure of time. But hopefully there's a few interesting things in what I've just said there. Hopefully we'll get a good discussion going shortly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel. Andy, how do you see it, Andy, in 2 minutes?
2 minutes, crikey. What she said. First point, I would say the subtitle we were given was Backdrop of an Uncertain Future. Let's not talk about uncertain, let's talk about exciting, because it is exciting, and I'm a glass half full kind of guy. Let's gallop through this. First thing, Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. You may not have heard of us, but we are a collaborative group. We get part funded by the Department for Transport, and the key point is we bring everybody around the same table to try and point in the same direction, and that's exactly what we need to do, and it's exactly what you're doing here, which is great to see. So, transport, we've got a series of revolutions going on. In the physical system, we've got a revolution in the vehicles, the technology, we've got a revolution in our energy, and the bit that joins that up together is the infrastructure, and I think that's really, really important. From my perspective, the vehicles we need, they're actually coming. We've got a whole range of different vehicles, including scooters that are not allowed on the public roads. We've got cargo bikes, we've got trucks, we've got technology. And one of the things we're doing within the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership is trying to help people navigate those technologies to pick the next right step for them. And it's really, really important that you can't always go all the way, but you can certainly make a step forward in terms of low carbon, more efficient and lower energy. The other key bit of really good news is that our energy system is decarbonising. 55% reduction in the carbon impact from our power sector over the last 5 years. That is an incredible achievement, and we really shouldn't underestimate that. Now, the problem we've got is that that's not actually the power that we're using in most of our vehicles yet, but we are making massive changes in the power system. So clean energy is coming, a range of different vehicles are already available. The infrastructure is one of the key challenges. Getting that energy, that clean energy, into those vehicles that can use it. We've spoken about electric vehicles, hydrogen, even more complex, LNG, CNG. That is where there's a real appetite, I think, for some extra activity. And if I have a criticism of the draft strategy, it's that the energy sector and the energy infrastructure wasn't sufficiently embraced in your strategic planning, because that is what we're finding is that is absolutely critical to support a transport system of the future. One of the things we're doing a lot of, and it is about making things happen. How do we make the next step? We all focus on 2050, net zero. We know where we want to get to. And I think Billy made the point, it's all very well. We can't wait until 2050 and then suddenly decarbonise. We've got to make steps, and everybody can make a step. It may only be 10%, 5%, it might be 50%, but we can all make a step. One of the things we're doing is trying to help public and businesses navigate what they can do to move forward. The other thing, and the Minister did flag up his decarbonisation, his avoiding disconnection, and the digitalisation. So the digital revolution is definitely happening, but there are some risks there. automated, autonomous vehicles aren't necessarily low carbon. They don't necessarily take us to a decongested zero emission. The road to zero could arguably be called a road to a zero emission traffic jam if we're not very careful. And I think that's one of the things we need to really think about carefully. So digital, absolutely, but let's make it work for us and not against us in the long term. The bit, and I think Rachel covered it really well in a couple of the points, the big one, the big thing that we've got to do and we've got to engage with is the behaviour revolution. People will need to make different choices. We heard it from Claire earlier about actually how do we get people to engage with the different opportunities. It's got to be better than it currently is in terms of their transport, but it's got to be better for all of us as well. So that full net mobility system really needs all of these elements, and I would say that behaviour is one of the key things, and that will take a generation. So we need to be planning that and taking that forward. Final slide. If you ask me, vehicles are actually the easy, and for me as an engineer, the exciting bit. But our strategic plan, your strategic plan, must embrace that energy strategy. And one of the really, I read through the draft strategy, and the thing that left me, and I really liked, was this focus on decide and provide. We are going to have to help people with where they've got to get to. We can't leave them all to make their own choices. So that principle of actually steering them in the right way towards the behaviours that we want them to exhibit is actually a critical point. And I will stop at that point. Thank you very much.
Andy. And finally, I'll give you Ben. Ben Lawson.
Thank you. So 2 minutes to talk to you about what does a fully integrated multimodal transport system look like. No problem. Well, I guess the easiest thing to start with is what it doesn't look like. We've heard a lot today about how different forms of transport on their own in singular fashion can't compete with car ownership. And in fact, what we've seen over recent years is these modal operators pretending to fight for the same customer, putting up barriers for people moving between different modals of transport, rather than joining together and providing a genuine alternative to car ownership. And when you think about where Rupert opened the day earlier on saying there is no silver bullet, that's exactly right. We need to bring all of these different pieces together to be able to provide the solution. And as we've seen, we've talked about today, there are some compelling challenges that our towns and cities and rural locations face today. Congestion and air quality has been spoken about a lot today. What hasn't been mentioned is actually the cost of that. Whether you want to talk about the number of people dying because of poor air quality, or the cost to our economy of congestion, or the cost to our health service of air quality, the numbers are staggering, which provides tremendous incentive to do something about it. So, why did we form the Urban Mobility Partnership? Well, the aim was to bring that supply chain together, along with other influencing factors, to be able to provide real-world answers to today's challenges. Stagecoach joined to represent both bus and rail. Enterprise for vehicle rental and share, both passenger and freight. Nextbike and Brompton, we saw some Bromptons, people arriving and leaving on those today, which is fantastic, for bike share and micro-mobility. Bosch for innovation and technology, and Ford Anstey for legal assistance. Bringing all of that supply chain together aimed at providing solutions for our towns and cities. And as we mentioned, no silver bullets, but let's think about some of the things that are there today that can combine for that alternative to private motor ownership. Real-world practical examples do exist. Car clubs are a great example. We heard George Freeman talk about how his children are using different forms of car club. Our children today don't want to buy cassettes. They don't want to buy LPs. They stream music. The same for transport. They don't want to own their own forms of transport. They want transport on demand when it suits them and in the fashion that they want it. Now, the great news is car clubs can provide that alternative to ownership for when a car is genuinely needed, for those journeys that other forms of transport won't warrant. Car club users are infinitely more likely to use other forms of public transit as well, and active travel. Now, through the Urban Mobility Partnership, we've actually put together mobility hubs, where car clubs live alongside bus and rail and tram and bike and car and active travel methodologies. But how do we make all of those visible to the users so that they understand the options available to them? If we're honest, if it wasn't for the fantastic job that TFSE did for us, telling us that when we got off the train today, there'd be the electric bus waiting for us, when we came out of the train station today, who would have known where to go? Who would have known what bus to take? It's too easy just to jump in the taxi because that's the way that we've always done it. And we heard earlier from some of the 17-year-olds that talked about, what if an app was there to tell us how to get from A to B and all the options that are available? Did you know in the last 2 months, 6 billion hours have been spent on travel applications, and that's just on Android devices alone? Be no surprise to know that at the top of that list of user was Uber. So how can we pull all of these forms of transport together in the digital age? Well, that's what Mobility as a Service does. So Mobility as a Service is a way of providing the transport options available for any journey in a transparent and clear manner that can be ranked either by fastest or lowest carbon emissions or any other factor that somebody has an interest in. It provides single payment and single ticketing, which is exactly what those younger generations said that they were looking for. We also heard in one of the earlier speeches, though, about what about that Uberification and what happened in California where it actually migrated people away from public transit and into taxis, which is not where we want to go. So how do we ensure good mass? Well, actually, in the excellent TFSE document, which I have read all the way through, I'm hoping many, many more have, or at least will do, on pages 84 to 87, there was a real focus on the challenges of new mobility and how mobility as a service can help. But mobility as a service must be used to reflect the desires of either TFSE or our towns and our cities in promoting the right forms of travel. That's why at the Urban Mobility Partnership, the mass application we use allows that decision-making layer to promote whatever the local authority is trying to drive and brings together the supply chain to be able to fulfill it. Let's take a look at one that we've already launched in one of the largest cities in the UK. Here's a pilot. As you can see, we've white-labelled it to be reflective of the town and city. In this case, actually, it's white-labelled as iMove and paid for by EU funding. Maybe not too much EU funding left for too much longer. But here, the city wanted to try and encourage people on to the tram network and the bus network and was promoting active travel. The decision-making layers here were not promoting car, but was actually telling people, instead of getting 2 buses, why don't you walk 300 yards and then it's only 1 bus? Why don't you get off the trams today? Because although the tram is fantastic, it's oversubscribed and the buses are on time. And that's another thing Mobility as a Service can do. It can provide real-time updates for travel so that you don't worry that your bus may be late today. If your bus is late, it's going to tell you to use a different form of transport. So what could Mobility as a Service do? We talked earlier about, well, for people in London, they can have a card that they can get access any form of transport. Well, Mobility as a Service enables all of our towns and cities and villages or corporations or NHS trusts to be able to put this together live today. All the forms of transport just need an API to be able to provide to the mass application layer. These mass application layers can be used to do a multitude of different things to incentivize good travel choices. They can be used to subsidize youth travel, as we talked about earlier. Or how about our elderly folks trying to get to hospital appointments? Maybe they can be subsidized through the application layer as well, much easier than they could through the hardware solutions that our towns and cities struggle with today. Achieving that change and having people to use those application layers is the key. How do we drive adaptation and adoption of these new travel methods? Well, there are a number of different ways that we can do that and where these mobility applications can be self-sustaining. How about with our planning applications today? Section 106 is slightly outdated. Why isn't it that every time you move into a new property that you have funding put onto a mass application that is only usable on approved transport networks? Then our people moving into our apartments and our tower blocks in the future won't need to bring a car. They'll have funding available for public and approved transit methodology. Corporate travel can do the same. We need to move our funding away from our company cars and onto our mass transit systems. And incentives can be done in a multitude of other ways. We talked about students before. Mass applications can enable students moving to university to have funding put on there that is approved for that university network's transport methodology. Again, that will be used to drive mass transit. Public and private sector needs to work together to be able to deliver it. And I'll leave you with one trial that we're running today as part of the Urban Mobility Partnership. Now, the challenges are often the same. It's about the need for expansion or the need for an improved network. We always need to improve customer journey, or in this case, employee retention, so that private motor ownership is not the most desired methodology. And that needs to be able to reduce congestion and improve air quality. The solution is always about enhancing that multimodal offering, using the mass application for the participants, and finding a Kickstarter or mobility credit to have people engage with that platform and understand it more convenient than traditional ownership. And the data and analytics from these mass platforms are phenomenal. Currently, our data shows us the ticket that somebody actually bought, but it doesn't show us all the journeys people plan to do. And if I tried to go from A to B and didn't buy the bus ticket, that data is more important than when I did, because it shows me the untapped demand that can be fulfilled through other modal transits, whether it be on-demand transport or whether it be a local authority understanding that actually look at that demand there, and what happens if I give them the free coffee to move to the other modal transit? Or what happens if there's a clean air zone? What am I going to be able to influence? And in the example that we're launching with an NHS trust, we are removing 15% of the NHS Trust car park, providing an increase in modal travel by putting on car club, bike share, and increasing bus capacity from key worker housing into the hospital network, providing a mass application layer for them to use to pull all of this together, and providing an incentive for new key workers being employed at that hospital that will have a £2,000 credit applied from NHS HR onto the application to help them adapt and adopt to the new transit levels. That will reduce transit onto an already congested and air quality stricken city that will provide real modal shift. This may not be a silver bullet, but it is part of what we can use to drive the future, and it's available today. So if you have any interest, reach out to us at the Urban Mobility Partnership and we'd be happy to share our solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.